At Göbekli Tepe, gods and mortals once walked the earth. So the old stories must surely once have told. Of the rituals, festivals, and sacrifices of those ancient days, we can say little now for certain. Its people are gone. Deities cast into the void. What truly happened there? We will likely never know. And yet, since its rediscovery by the wider world in the 1990s, archaeologists, anthropologists, and historians have done their best to weave together a flimsy shell of a story to do justice to that low-rising mound in the plains outside of Urfa. Utilising a vast array of data and techniques to mesh together a very basic idea of what the place was and who its builders had been. More outlandish commenters go further, embellishing the flimsy archaeological dataset with their own New Age religious leanings and preconceived ideas. Turning concrete evidence of wild grasses, wild grains, and as yet still undomesticated prey animals into landing grounds for aliens, or the biblical Garden of Eden. Wonderfully complex, genuine hunter-gatherer ancestors into ancient super-civilizations. In reality, still, for the most part, Göbekli Tepe's secrets remain hidden. Unlike the other most famous discoveries in archaeological history, like Tutankhamun's tomb or the royal burial grounds of Ur, here there is very little to go on. Little contemporary evidence to corroborate what happened. To explain those 200 or so monoliths arrayed into 20 megalithic enclosures. Some standing well over 5 meters high, their surfaces coated in bizarre, even nightmarish creatures. Written accounts wouldn't exist for more than 5,000 years to come. In recent years, the discoveries of neighbouring sites with enclosures similar in scale, like Karahan Tepe, add to the already swelling ranks of a so-called Stone Hills complex in the foothills of the southern Taurus Mountains. Sites like Navali Chori and Shianu. The sheer fact that Göbekli Tepe is not in fact unique, but one piece in a much larger picture, makes it all the more enigmatic and captivating. Thus opening up seemingly endless new lines of inquiry. With its origins lying well over 10,000 years in the past. Perhaps its antecedents even longer. The sheer age of this incredibly sophisticated Stone Age culture has been enough to solidify its place at the very forefront of prehistoric archaeology. even making inroads to the world of popular culture. It's one of the big ones. One of the most significant archaeological discoveries and biggest excavations of all time. On par with Jericho, Uruk, and the tomb of Pakal. Though found much sooner, only in the 1990s, Göbekli Tepe's impact on the cultural zeitgeist has already been as great as that of the Lascaux cave art in the 1800s. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made, and in which ways the evidence and research will point. And yet, still, even after spending so much time and effort in excavation, we are still, for the most part, left answerless, adrift to ponder and contemplate the outrageously complicated carvings and temples left behind by those people who lived so impossibly long ago. It will take many more decades, centuries even, until the sheer amount of evidence piles up high enough that the mysteries of those ancient days can truly be unlocked and retold. As of 2021, less than 5% of the site has been excavated. And yet, utilising the very latest archaeological data, historical stories, and mythological and anthropological theories, this is the entire history of not just Göbekli Tepe, but the world it inhabited. You're watching History Time. As always, I'm your host, Pete Kelly, the one-man team behind the channel. If you want to help me out as I continue to make these gargantuan monsters, then don't forget to like and subscribe, leave a comment letting me know what you think, and sign up to my free newsletter where I travel to distant lands, visiting the greatest archaeological sites humanity has ever known. Shortly, we'll get back to one of those rare, greatest of all time sites, one of the most mysterious of all. It's taken me well over a year to make, and it's nearly 3 hours long. But first, a quick word from our sponsor. Thanks to War Thunder for making this ridiculously time-consuming long-form project possible. In the millennia following Göbekli Tepe, armoured Bronze Age warriors dominated battlefields, like this one found at Dendra in Greece. By the medieval era, now mounted on horseback, similarly kitted out soldiers did the same. It wasn't until the 1910s and 20s that real tanks would be constructed, completely changing warfare forevermore. War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made. With its incredible graphics and details in 4K resolution, authentic sound effects and beautiful music, you can immerse yourself in the atmosphere as you choose from more than 2,000 tanks, planes, helicopters and ships to engage in dynamic combined arms PvP battles. Of course, one aspect of the game that I like in particular is its historical accuracy and the chance to play as some of the very first clunky monstrosities ever to be built in the years following World War I. The collection of vehicles found in War Thunder spans over 100 years of fascinating history, in fact, from the 1920s to today. Every vehicle being incredibly detailed and modelled down to their individual components, offering a highly immersive combat experience. Use my link in the description below to play now for free on PC, Xbox and PlayStation 5. Or, for you old school people out there, you can even play on a previous generation console. Thanks again to War Thunder for sponsoring this video, and now, back to the ancient past. When the final blocks of cement went into place on Turkey's Kaban Dam in 1968, millions of litres of water quickly shifted into a torrent. Inundating one of the richest archaeological landscapes in the world. Countless irreplaceable settlements and monuments disappearing under the flood. The first of many similar investments by the Turkish government in order to feed and water the tens of millions of people living in the dry southeast of the country. Though widely condemned internationally, largely by nations with plenty of drinking water themselves, Turkey's government was then far from a corrupt dictatorship, as in many places in the Middle East. As a result of the reforms of Ataturk some decades earlier, a genuine homegrown desire to pursue archaeological investigation had been followed. Accompanying the colossal construction projects to flood ancient river valleys came a number of cutting-edge digs. Instigated both by Turkish teams, now catching up with the West in terms of sophistication, and an invasion of well-funded researchers from all over the world. Invited in to help with this unique opportunity to rescue an entire region's ancient past. It wasn't long before astounding discoveries began to be made. Four years earlier, in 1964, an American team working at the Neolithic site of Şanlıurfa had already pushed the clock back in the region by thousands of years. Under the supervision of Robert Braidwood, the settlement had been found to date to well over 10,000 years ago. Braidwood would continue to work at Şanlıurfa for another 14 seasons. But it was at Navali Chori where headlines around the world would truly be made. Hidden in a small side valley of the Euphrates, in a region already earmarked for submersion under another lake that was planned to be formed. Navali Chori, translating rather ominously as the Valley of the Plague, was initially investigated in 1979. At first thought to be early Bronze Age in origin, it turned out to be so much older. Like Şanlıurfa, Navali Chori was well over 10,000 years old. When excavations began at the early Neolithic site in 1983, it wasn't long before an unusually complex series of massive, freestanding stone buildings began to be unearthed. Initially known as the Roman burial, from 1987 onwards, the digs brought forth things never before seen by modern eyes. A terrazzo floored building or enclosure began to be unearthed. Elaborately constructed with layers of burned lime. And then, as they dug ever downwards, one of the pillars turned out to be an anthropomorphic being from an even earlier time. Unfortunately, its head was missing. The archaeologists were simply astonished. And as the place disappeared under the waters of the Ataturk Dam in the winter of early 1992, left to ponder the ancestors, gods, or demons that had once called the place home. At around the same time, one of the German archaeologists working at Novali Chori would often make trips to the museum in Şanlıurfa. His name was Klaus Schmidt, and we will be hearing much more from him soon. With a population of well over 1 million, one of the great cities in world history, Urfa was given its honorific title of Şanlı, meaning honoured, at the dawn of the 20th century, after stalwart defences against the Russians in the turmoil of that age. But long before that, it had a different name. Edessa. From this medieval powerhouse, foreign crusader lords had carved out a kingdom in the similarly chaotic 12th century. The city's fall had been the main catalyst for the Second Crusade. The name itself was brought by Alexander the Great during his incessant march to the ends of the earth in the 4th century BC. Given by his soldiers to remind them of the Edessa in their homeland of Macedon. But even in those days, the place was already old. Situated around a number of karstic springs, rich irrigated farmland stretches out in all directions, just as it has for millennia. The great rain-providing chain of the Taurus Mountains and the Anatolian Plateau beyond, rising to the north, at this gateway to the rolling plains of Mesopotamia. The myths and legends associated with the place are legion, enough for entire libraries of scholars. Though most have been lost down the millennia, none is more famed than the supposed association with the prophet Abraham, patriarch of the 3 religions of the book. Said to have venerated the holy springs here. just how long people had lived around those pools at the centre of town. At the time, no one could say. But one thing is always abundantly clear. Urfa has lived many lives. On one fateful visit to the museum in 1994, as usual, Klaus Schmidt perused the storerooms of the influential institution. Losing himself for a time among the myriad Byzantine and Greco-Roman altars. Though it seemed an entirely ordinary day, everything in his life was about to change. Now armed with the newly gained knowledge of Navali Chori, Klaus Schmidt saw something in the Urfa Museum that shouldn't have been there. Two naturalistic statues, reptilian in form. Erroneously categorised as Byzantine, Schmidt immediately knew better. Recognising similarities to the vastly more ancient sites he'd been working on. But how had they got to the museum? And where had they come from? Thankfully, someone at the museum knew exactly. And just a few hours later, Schmidt, along with two colleagues, were in a taxi. Heading along dirt roads to the hill country northeast of the city. To an obscure plot of land on a desolate rock, known as Potbelly Hill. And as Schmidt would soon find out, its Turkish name, Göbekli Tepe, was already known to archaeology. Seven or 8 years earlier, local landowner Ibrahim Yildiz and his son Mammoth had been clearing scrubland up on the hill overlooking their property, when one of their spades hit something solid. Strange statues were then pulled up out of the ground. But there was a problem. In the confused days that followed, as one of the statues clearly had a large penis showing, the two men kept them hidden, as a steady stream of villagers came by to see the discovery. Not wanting to be perceived as idolatrous and bring shame upon their family, eventually the local imam came to see the finds. Far from chastising the men, recognising the potential significance of the finds, he encouraged the two farmers to take them to the Urfa Museum. Heading by horse cart along the old road to the west, once the two men arrived, the museum manager politely informed them the pieces were regrettably not very old, nor particularly significant. Demoralised, thinking the journey had been for nothing, in order to not have to pay for another cart ride home, they left the pieces in the museum garden. No blame should be placed on the museum staff, however, nor the farmers, for at the time, nothing of the sort had ever been found before. And this wasn't the first time the significance of Göbekli Tepe had been missed. Close to 30 years earlier, in the 1960s, during Robert Braidwood's initial work at Şanlıurfa, another American archaeologist had scoured the region in search of evidence for similar sites. And though his ensuing report, dating from 1963 until 1972, ultimately missed the true significance of the place, Peter Benedict had spent quite some time at Göbekli Tepe. Amidst a vast carpet of thousands of flint stones gleaming under the scorching sun, he'd found broken pottery pieces, flint blades, and stone artifacts, many of which had been piled up by farmers over the span of decades, if not centuries. And yet, Göbekli Tepe was just one tell amongst thousands. Curiously, in the shadow of a great mulberry tree rising from the crest of the hill, Benedict wrote of locating a cemetery site, one which has never been found. Islamic burial grounds are of course taboo for archaeologists, which could be the cause of him writing the place off for further investigation. It simply didn't cross Benedict's wildest imagination that practically the entire hill could be a great man-made tell, dating from the pre-pottery Neolithic. Built up from the refuse of thousands of years of occupation. But when Schmidt arrived in 1994, it wasn't long before he made that exact conclusion. Far from a cemetery site, the half-buried stones on the top of the hill, in the process of being gradually dug out by local farm workers, were the very same style of T-shaped pillars previously found at Navali Chori. But here, they were everywhere he looked. With just a little trial digging, artifacts too could be pulled out easily from the ground. Just like the ones from the Urfa Museum, without which the site might not have been found. When Turkish archaeologist Murat Akman arrived at the hill, whose previous digging experience included both Çiğonu and at Navali Chori under Schmidt's mentor Harold Hauptmann, Schmidt didn't have to say anything at all. With little more than a look, both men knew intuitively everything in their field was about to change. Southeastern Turkey could be a dangerous place at that time, shaken by fierce fighting with Kurdish separatist groups. And when the local villagers saw a group of strangers wandering around their fields that day, they turned up armed and ready to defend themselves. Eventually, through the diplomatic skills of a Kurdish taxi driver, the situation became disarmed, and the AK-47 wielding village guardians backed down. On that day, Klaus Schmidt realised, for better or for worse, his previous research plans had become utterly irrelevant. He had no choice but to dedicate the rest of his life to the place. Just 1 year later, a massive team arrived, and one of the great digs in world history began. The farmers, already inadvertently in the process of excavating, were paid compensation for their land. And even though the damage wrought by spade and plough over the decades and centuries was great, the sheer scale and preservation of the site was astounding to behold. dig was slow and methodical, utilising the very latest in cutting-edge scientific techniques. But almost immediately, a number of realisations were made. Not just one area, but the entire hill was coated in megalithic architecture. All sides worked carefully by hand. Not only that, but broken pieces were everywhere too. Many now housed in the so-called Garden of Stones on one side of the hill. The earliest semi-subterranean enclosures of Navali Chori, meticulously documented in the 1980s, did indeed have similar features to those found at Göbekli Tepe. They dated from the same time when carbon dated, some 12,000 years ago, not long after the end of the last ice age. But these were much bigger. A couple of seasons later, and Göbekli Tepe was the most famous archaeological site in the world. Stretching for some 25 acres, at least 20 stone circles were unearthed, each containing pillars as much as 9 feet tall, coated in completely unprecedented, elaborate carvings. Predating Stonehenge and the pyramids of Egypt by some 7,000 years. The evidence clearly showed the makers of this extraordinary set of monuments to be a people without the technology to create pottery. And even more astonishingly, just like the earliest levels of Navali Chori contemporary with it, entirely devoid of agriculture. Only the remains of wild animals and wild plants being found. Within eyesight of Urfa, somehow having avoided discovery for all those millennia, Göbekli Tepe had once been a place of immense significance. And as the seasons went on, and the evidence continued to mount up, Klaus Schmidt began to form his opinions of the place as a spiritual centre for an affluent nomadic people in a changing world, beginning to settle down and farm. But here, not yet. Clearly possessing a complex and well-developed culture and mythology, reminiscent of our Paleolithic ancestors. This was a sanctuary of profound importance. On the border between hunter-gatherers and our settled world to come. Now, some 20 years later, digs continue, and the site, which will always get funding, only becomes more and more interesting. Geophysical surveys continue to show vast numbers of other structures still buried under the earth, only 5% of the site having been excavated. Today, Göbekli Tepe remains one of the key sites for understanding the transition from hunters to farming, and the birth of civilization as we know it. When viewed from the old castle in Urfa, Göbekli Tepe can clearly be seen on the western horizon. Its pot-bellied silhouette is the highest point on the windswept Urfa plain. On first glance, particularly in the height of summer, it seems an unforgiving place, trapped in the gaze of the boiling sun, without any obvious source of water. And yet, the probable remains of a Roman watchtower stand on the hillside. Clear evidence of ancient quarrying all around. On closer inspection, at more than half a metre in diameter, it's possible that the large stone rings all over the site could have served as cisterns for rainwater. And from the top of the hill, you can see springs dotted around, such as those at nearby Balik, and perhaps more existed in antiquity, long since having dried away. What is obvious from walking the ridgeline on the pot-bellied hill is that it very much possesses a commanding view of a landscape all around. The Taurus Mountains to the north, and the plains of Haran to the south. When arriving from the south, in particular the next city of Mardin, another vaunted settlement famous from Crusader times, Göbekli Tepe can clearly be picked out from a distance of some 20 kilometres or more. With the benefit of hindsight, it is difficult to understand how such a place was missed. The landscape itself seeming to hint at a certain level of significance, once you know where you're looking. And when the buildings finally began to be stabilised and excavated in the mid-1990s, sunken chambers dug deep into the hillside, opening up for the first time in well over 10,000 years. The place only became more and more unusual. No obvious fireplaces were found, no ovens, no trace of domestic life of any sort, wrote Klaus Schmidt in an early report, concluding the structures to not only be unroofed, but ultimately unsuitable for human habitation. In stark contrast to Navali Chori, which, in its later phases at least, was settled by very early sedentary farmers, living in permanent houses. Göbekli Tepe, with no evidence of settled agriculture whatsoever, seemed to be purely ceremonial in character. For Schmidt, all of the excavated buildings from the second and third levels at Göbekli Tepe had been houses, but of the divine. At least in the lower levels, built not by early Neolithic farmers, but by hunter-gatherers, still living from the foraged bounty of the earth. Just maybe, like Greek Delphi or Cusco in Peru, sacred navels of the earth, where pilgrims would travel from afar, for sporadic festival activities, including the raising of vast monuments to ancient gods, ancestors, or demons. But not living at the site all year round. Göbekli Tepe could have been a cultic site. A vast collection of animal remains have been uncovered at Göbekli Tepe, including cattle, pigs, goats, and large numbers of gazelle. But after intense study by some of the leading experts in the world, all of the animals were found to have been wild, and not domesticated variants, which have different bone structures. same as the plant remains, wild almond, pistachio and grains being found in abundance, wild variants of which still grow in the area today. One early idea that made its way into the popular zeitgeist in the late 90s, posited in part due to the glossed sickle blades and early forms of wild wheat found at the site, was the suggestion of Göbekli Tepe having been one of the actual locations where the process of Neolithicization began. In other words, where hunter-gatherers first began experimenting with farming. After all, when agriculture did begin to take hold, analysis of ancient grains does seem to place one of its origin points on the Urfa plain. One early idea suggests the controlled use of cereals and other foodstuff to have resulted from over-exploitation of local resources, as a result of increasingly large groups of people congregating over an extended period of time. In his 2004 masterpiece, After the Ice, Stephen Mithen goes further, conjuring up images of acolytes ritualistically handing seeds back and forth at some long-lost ancient ceremonies, before moving on to other locales to spread some foundational message or story. We know from elsewhere in the world that stone circles and megaliths are often erected at times of great turmoil and change. By 2014, Klaus Schmidt had published a number of articles and a detailed book on the initial finds at Göbekli Tepe, and another was on the way. Still only 3 or 4% of the site having been excavated, though already making it one of the top archaeological destinations in the world, making its way into all sorts of pseudo-archaeological theories in the process. For 20 years, ever modest and patient, Klaus Schmidt had been a willing servant to the site, devoting all of his energy to speaking tours and tourism, to fighting misinformation and spreading awareness of archaeology to the general public. Always making himself available, even when publicly attacked by fringe theorists and dogmatic ageing archaeologists alike. Finally, by 2014, it all came to an end. One Sunday afternoon, in a swimming pool back in his native Germany, Klaus Schmidt's heart gave out. By the time of his death in 2014, Klaus Schmidt had already cemented his place in the annals of archaeology. His dig will go down as one of the most famous in all of history, completely altering our understanding of the origins of civilization as we know it. Like Troy, Olympia, and the great Mayan ruins of Copan, digs will likely go on for another century or more. The place will never struggle to get funding. And most amazing of all, by that time, and in the years since, yet more similar sites have been unearthed too. Perhaps most famously at Karahan Tepe, but a whole host of others being dug too, partly by an entire new generation of eager Turkish archaeologists, inspired by the likes of Klaus Schmidt. The results are astonishing. Far from an isolated phenomenon, Göbekli Tepe was part of an entire culture, similarly built by hunter-gatherers, many of whom, like at Chianu and Navali Chori, turned ultimately to incipient agriculture by the end of the lifespans of their settlements. When compared to the common model of previously discovered early farming communities in the Near East, generally located further along the Levantine shore to the south, at places like Jericho, Göbekli Tepe and its sister sites offers a very different point of view. Here, rather than domestic dwellings, the utmost effort seems to have been placed in creating monuments of a non-utilitarian nature. Vast amounts of time and energy going into creating more than 200 T-shaped pillars, the largest of which stand 3 or 4 times taller than the height of a person. Intricately arrayed into at least 20 stone circles, coated in carvings. Stretching for some 25 acres, the place was clearly of the utmost importance to all who took part. Only to be intentionally filled around 8000 BC, consigned to oblivion at the end of its life. Even more paradigm-breaking was the fact that it was the earliest levels that yielded some of the largest and most impressive pillars and animal carvings. In complete defiance of conventional logic, the monoliths seemed to get smaller and more modest over time. Far from a hypothesized beginning of all things, Göbekli Tepe seems curiously like an end, hinting of a great mythological tradition stretching far back into the perennial mists of the Ice Age. It's even possible that long-lost wooden circles preceded it. Similarly once vaunted monuments that rotted away to oblivion so many thousands of years in the past. For Klaus Schmidt, ever living in hope of finding a foundational cemetery site under one of the enclosures, and partly in light of arms and hands having been found adorning some of the pillars, they perhaps having once represented individuals. The site may have been a monument to revered ancestors. Clearly, whatever its purpose, this was a place built with great skill and care. The 7-metre long threaded pillar still lying in its quarry on the northern plateau tells us that much, with other quarry sites found around the hill. Though it wasn't only construction technologies that were in use here, but logistical support networks just as well developed as the mythology and ritual lives of this most ancient of prehistoric societies. Far from long-standing construction projects put together over lengthy periods of time, the archaeology suggests each enclosure having been raised in a singular weeks or months long event. Without animal power nor metal tools, Schmidt hypothesized that around 500 people would be required as labour, further speculating on the existence of some kind of a priestly class to plan, organise and contextualise the work. Perhaps either intentionally or inadvertently united in a singular purpose it had the effect of binding the group together, a form of communal worship operating as the social glue. Since Klaus Schmidt's death, an increasingly wide range of alternate hypotheses have been discussed too. Far away in the midst of the distant Pacific Ocean, experiments with the megaliths of Easter Island have shown that the moai there could in fact have been crafted and erected by significantly smaller groups of people than Schmidt's hundreds. In one experiment, just 12 men were able to raise a 20-ton statue in just under 3 weeks. It is plausible, though by no means definitive, that Schmidt overstated the amount of labour needed at Göbekli Tepe. With just a few dozen individuals potentially having quarried and erected the monoliths there. Given the sunken nature of the enclosures, and the particularly impressive floors within, it is also possible that the megaliths did indeed once support roofs. An artificial cave rather than temple to the star-studded sky. Like at Navali Chori and Chianu, the flooring found in the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe was made in a style known as terrazzo, the earliest such examples found anywhere in the world, laboriously created by layering burned lime and clay over and over again to create a smooth, luxurious surface. At Navali Chori and Chianu, however, only one example has been found. At Göbekli Tepe, they appear over and over again. In one case, 4 terrazzo floors having been built directly on top of one another down the long generations. For all the work of an army of scientists and scholars, it of course remains impossible to fully reconstruct the interactions of that long-gone culture today. Of how the people at Göbekli interacted with Chianu, Navali Chori, Karahan and the others. Whether they borrowed elements from each other into their own way of life. Whether they already shared the same culture and stories. However, the same themes do crop up again and again, most obviously in the myriad carvings and bas-reliefs that march, crawl and fly over every visible surface. Almost all of the depictions are of animals, appearing so fully formed and so near unfathomably old to be difficult to comprehend. It is these exceptionally artistic carvings that give us the best chance of bringing back from extinction just a little of that clearly well-developed ancient culture, giving us some insights into just why this place came into being, and some inkling into the long road to our world which may have been forged in the process. In 1993, just before the discoveries at Göbekli Tepe, construction workers digging around the Balacagal area of the Urfa city centre came across something they weren't expecting. Astride the ancient deep water springs known today as the Pools of Abraham, blank, lifeless eyes stared back from the foundation rubble. prominently displayed today in the cutting-edge new museum at the heart of the city. The Urfa Man stands at 1.8 metres tall. At around 11,000 years old, it is the oldest life-sized naturalistic sculpture of a human ever discovered in the world. And though very heavily damaged by construction work down the long millennia since its creation, when briefly investigated in 1997 before construction work was finished, the earth around the statue turned out to be a pre-pottery Neolithic settlement, with similarities to Göbekli Tepe. Concrete evidence of the deep antiquity of the city. And yet, the sculptures at Göbekli Tepe are quite different from even the pre-pottery Neolithic world, at the very beginning of agriculture. Theirs was a symbolic landscape populated almost entirely by the wild. On all of the excavated enclosures, particularly on A, B, C, D, E and F, powerful animal forms are displayed, often depicted with prominent penises. For some reason, unlike in early near-contemporary farming societies, the female form is almost never depicted. No clay, so-called Earth Mother figurines are to be found. Here, in a quite different culture to that of the South, at places like Jericho, the ferocious world of the hunters took precedent. In Enclosure C, where 3 concentric rings of walls were successively built up, one after the other over the years, gradually receding the size of the interior, feral pigs dominate. In this so-called House of the Boars, wild pigs bare their teeth menacingly. Another lies on its back, deceased perhaps. Almost all of the animals are male. Several depictions of human skulls are found too, ranging from the small to larger than life. Some also displaying prominent and erect penises. Unexplained holes, stepping stones and small cups are found too, with suggestions being made of stands for small fires to light the enclosure during the night. Interpretations of the enclosure range from the cultic house of a clan utilising the boar as a heraldic totem, to a nightmarish depiction of beasts guarding the entrance to the underworld. Enclosure D, which Klaus Schmidt fondly referred to as the Stone Age Zoo, is a much more varied affair, a veritable smorgasbord of fauna on display. Like Enclosure C, a fox can be seen, darting around the other creatures. Though this one has snakes coming out where his penis should be. Long seen as particularly wise animals, in later Mesopotamian myth and beyond, and with links to potentially even earlier shamanic beliefs from all over the world. Suggestions are often made of allusions to shape-shifting rituals and trances, with the fox representing the figure of the shaman. Elsewhere, gazelle gallop across the stones. Judging by their frequency on the pillars in many of the enclosures, and in the skeletal remains, they seem to be of particular importance. Vultures are seen too, creatures long associated with the realm of the dead. But other birds proliferate too. Cranes, a type of migratory water bird, are common, perhaps suggesting some appreciation for the particularly striking dance periodically undertaken by these animals. Among the more frequent motifs depicted at Göbekli Tepe is the snake. In cultures all over the world, often associated with the underworld. In the late 1980s, one of the most striking finds made at Navali Chori was the so-called snake bearer. A larger-than-life statue with a poisonous viper bursting forth from the back of his bald head. Though the face had unfortunately been broken off long ago. At nearby Kortik Tepe, many such serpentine images are found too, scratched on stone vessels, as well as scorpions, another animal associated with the realm of the dead, found also at Göbekli Tepe. Similarly, on the Middle Euphrates, at the important site of Jurf el-Akhmar, pictograms are also seen. They are also found even as far away as Tel Caramel to the south, in Mesopotamia proper, where mighty prehistoric towers like those of Jericho are found too. The lands between Göbekli Tepe and the plains to the south seem to have been a borderland of converging cultures and ideas. A melting pot of different, yet not isolated, cultural trajectories and ideas. The more we learn about the world around Göbekli Tepe, filling in the vacuum that existed in the early 90s, the more incredible the tale becomes. However tempting it may be to speak of the serpent tempting Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, any such allusions to far later stories may well be entirely illusory. Quite simply, though many would beg to differ, with elaborate intellectual journeys of shamanic rituals and totemic creatures, for the most part, the images at Göbekli Tepe have lost their meaning. The intricate, often crowded gatherings of creatures, be they guardians, culture heroes, or symbolic representations to ensure hunting success, may well also be illustrated storytelling aids for fables once as famous as those we all know today, long before Adam and Eve. who's to say that to the ancestors they wouldn't have made total sense? No explanation needed. Like the Buddha, Jesus, or McDonald's today. Today, visitors to the site still tie strips of cloth to a mulberry wishing tree. Perhaps a remainder of a custom from long ago, when visitors arrived to pay their respects and beseech the divine for terrestrial favour. Though we can't say for certain what the purpose of the stone carvings was, they remain powerful representations of a clearly elaborate mythology. The most astonishing example, in fact, of a spectacularly profound creative explosion that took place here at the headwaters of the Balik Valley some 12,000 years ago. For Schmidt, one sculptured high-relief carving in particular totally outclassed the rest. The masterpiece of a Stone Age Michelangelo. And just like the Urfa Man, there is freestanding sculpture too. Though much remains in a very poor state of preservation. One colossal stone head may well have originally been part of a totem pole-like composite found also at Navali Chori and Karahan Tepe. But of course, most famously in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. But out there, on the remote Pacific edge, such totemic creations lined the thresholds of domestic homes as much as houses of the gods. Since Klaus Schmidt's death in 2014, another academic idea that has gained in prominence is the suggestion that the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe may not only have been roofed after all, but could in fact have acted as sleeping quarters as much as temples. Whilst completely true that the structures at Göbekli Tepe look nothing like previously documented houses from the pre-pottery Neolithic, it could be that they are simply a previously unknown example, with no precedent discovered anywhere before. Pre-pottery Neolithic buildings were often built with the apparent intention for them to act as focal points for rituals, feasts, initiation ceremonies, and the deaths and burials of members of the community. It's not impossible to suggest that they could have acted as houses in other times too. Or maybe at all times. Like Iroquois longhouses, or the mead halls of an early medieval chief. But did the people of Göbekli Tepe actually live there permanently? In recent years, Klaus Schmidt's assertions of no domestic activity at all being carried out at the site have been challenged. After all, there are significant amounts of tools related to domestic activity present at the site, as well as ostentatious animal remains. As for drinking water, rock-cut cisterns and pools are found all over the hill. And in the more humid boreal period of some 12,000 years ago, the water table may well have been considerably higher, with the possibility of other water sources located nearby. All in all, It's not completely outlandish to suggest that a small permanent staff could have lived on the site all year round, swelling to a much larger population at certain times of the year for festival activities. Perhaps including the raising of monoliths. In ancient Egypt, for example, the very act itself being sacred. But what of those people who lived and worked at Göbekli Tepe? Human skeletal evidence remains extremely rare, just a few hundred scraps of bones having been recovered, 2/3 of which are skull fragments. A few of them show evidence of decapitation and defleshing. Ominously, 3 have holes drilled into them, perhaps to be hung up or mounted on a pole. It's a tiny, potentially nightmarish window into those ancient days. Though equally, the finds may well represent the venerated remains of dearly loved ancestors. Perhaps relating to the so-called cult of the skull, which continued on in the Levant for thousands of years, and even predates Göbekli Tepe at Natufian sites to the south. However, equally probable evidence at nearby Chianu cannot be overlooked. There, on a blood-encrusted altar, ritualistic human sacrifices may well have been carried out. Perhaps shedding light on a darker side of the Göbekli Tepe phenomenon. Though no direct, irrefutable evidence has yet come to light, and the Chianu finds are ever open to revised interpretation. By around 8200 BC, whether a community of complex hunter-gatherers had indeed lived at Göbekli Tepe permanently or not, life at the site came to an end. In a scene reminiscent of the so-called house-closing rituals of later Neolithic sites like Çatalhöyük, and at Maya cities alike, the very last stone circle, made up of human-shaped pillars much smaller than its predecessors, was, just like the previous circles had been, intentionally buried under up to 3 meters of earth. Though it's possible people continued to come to the place in the years after, very little could now be seen above ground. It's likely that symbolically, the place was dead. Many conclusions have been drawn as to the end of Göbekli Tepe, ranging from violent conflict, drought, starvation, and zoonotic disease, to new conditions of sedentism, making the old ritual places of the hunters irrelevant. The reality remains a total mystery. But in examining the context of the birth of the Neolithic, and how Göbekli Tepe came into being in the first place, we can uncover yet more clues. as the colossal ice sheets that had held Europe in thrall for tens of thousands of years finally began their long retreat back to the frigid Arctic wastes. By around 12,000 BC, the foothills of the southern Taurus Mountains were awash with green. Lush river valleys ran tracks past verdant prairies. Ever-expanding forests of pistachio and oak. Spreading along the open frontier to previously barren plateaus and patches of scrub-studded desert. And into this new Eden came vast herds of gazelle, along with wild boar making their homes in the woodland. All manner of goat, auroch and bird wandering the hills and riversides. It was a landscape teeming with life. And for the previously isolated communities of late Paleolithic humans, often restricted to sheltered refuges in the wake of harsh climatic conditions, it must have seemed like paradise. Climate models built up from prehistoric ice cores over the last 80 years or so suggest a significant increase in both rainfall and temperature following the last glacial maximum of around 13,000 BC. Thus paving the way for the emergence of a new way of life. Though still wide-roaming, people were beginning to settle down into territories. Landscapes they knew extremely well, more so than ever before. Landscapes of dangerous carnivores and poisonous reptiles, of swift-running game, waterfowl and furry scavengers. This was the world inhabited by the builders of Göbekli Tepe. To the west and north, the snow-capped peaks of the Taurus Range loom. To the south, the Haran Plain stretches all the way to what is now Syria and Iraq beyond. To the northeast, the great mountain of Karakadog sprawls. Always prominent extinct volcano, from where some of the earliest evidence of cultivated einkorn wheat has been found. Perhaps it is no coincidence that in a great arc around Göbekli Tepe, some of the most important early Neolithic sites found anywhere have been discovered. At Tel Caramel, Jurf El Akhmar and Chianu, to mention a few. The evidence speaks of a world on the verge of agriculture. It's evidence that the great early 20th century prehistorian V. Gordon Childe could only have dreamed of when he first coined the term Neolithic Revolution. In the 1930s. And yet, far from being a simple picture, the story only becomes more and more complex. By around 10,800 BC, a relatively brief, yet still centuries-long return to cold, dry conditions of the last Pleistocene was ushered in. Potentially lasting for 1,000 years. Since its initial discovery, well over a century ago, the Younger Dryas period has loomed large in accounts of the origins of agriculture. with the suspicion that many newly swelled communities would have had to change their lifestyles yet again. Congregating around water supplies and possibly intensifying their food production strategies. According to some theorists, beginning to experiment with sowing and tending crops and cereals, and eventually to trap and keep animals. In recent years, the picture has changed yet again, with the recognition that early theorists like Child succeeded in explaining the how, but not the why, or perhaps most importantly, the when. Just in the last decade, vast amounts of new empirical data has continued to stack up, creating an increasingly fine-tuned account of the transition from foraging to farming. The evidence overwhelmingly suggesting not one origin, but many places and many times. Some ultimately unsuccessful attempts taking place long before Göbekli Tepe. Rather than a revolution per se, eliciting the idea of some kind of an overnight transformation, the initial shift from hunter-gathering to farming took place at its very quickest over multiple generations, with myriad experiments, tipping points, failures, and even regressions along the way. One particularly early example of attempted plant domestication was found on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. At Ohalo II, the remarkable remains of a Paleolithic settlement yielded an impressive array of seed grasses and legumes, along with the tools needed to thresh and cultivate them. Thus, by the time the first monoliths were erected in the southern foothills of the Taurus Mountains, humans had already been experimenting with farming for over 10,000 years. The evidence from this one very small community continues to detract from the hypothesis of population pressure being the primary driver of sedentism and agriculture. Animal husbandry was different. As we have seen, no domesticated animals at all have been found at Göbekli Tepe, and very few before that time anywhere else in the world. The process of domestication, which actually changes the physiology of the animal in question, is only even possible with a very small number of animals. And even then, the shock and trauma of captivity very often creates infertile or deformed offspring, if procreation is even possible at all. In short, animal domestication requires a great deal of effort, with very little return in the short term. There are some indications that Göbekli's neighbouring site of Şanlıurfa was somewhat successful with the domestication of wild boar, with remains having multiple indicators of domesticity by around 8 or 9,000 BC, by which time the place had been a permanent settlement for quite some time. The evidence for farming being the main cause of sedentism keeps getting smaller and smaller. even at Çatalhöyük, a vast Neolithic proto-city of at least 5,000 people that developed much later than Göbekli Tepe. There is almost no evidence of domesticated animals. Hunting still playing a huge role in the ritual and domestic life of the community. To the south of Göbekli Tepe, along the Levantine shore, not far from Ohalo 2, can be found some of the best evidence for the origins of so-called Neolithicization. For here, in a surprisingly well-studied region, people seem to have begun to truly settle down towards the end of the last ice age. This was the time of the Natufians. And incredibly, there is good evidence here for a revolution not in farming technologies, but in the mind. First discovered by pioneering archaeologist Dorothy Garrod in the early 20th century, and named after the type site of Wadi al-Natuf in what is now Palestine. Like Göbekli Tepe, the astonishing culture of the Natufians made headlines all over the world. The Natufians still lived a largely hunter-gatherer existence, but seemed much more of a complex state than groups before. They lived in set areas, in settled villages, where they returned to bury their dead, engage in elaborate burial rituals, and create impressive works of art. Traits which probably reinforced cultural identities and links to the land. Perhaps one of the first complex societies found anywhere. So then, was it culture, human creativity, rather than economics that spurred on the adoption of agriculture? And just how far back does the evidence go? The first visible glimmerings of human creativity in the archaeological record appear on the southern tip of Africa as much as 100,000 years ago, in the form of ochre pigments, and later in crafted shell decorations. As much as 100,000 years after the first evidence of anatomically modern humans identical to us today, capable of complex forms of communication for the first time. However, it is only after around 45,000 years ago that evidence for creative complexity really begins to be found. In isolated pieces, like the Lion Man of Hohenstein Stadel, scattered Venus figurines, and ultimately in the cave paintings of the Upper Paleolithic. Arguably, it is only with the likes of the Natufian some 15,000 years ago, and perhaps the Kabarun before it, that evidence of societal formation really begins. Of larger groups of 100 or more living permanently together in close proximity all year round. The question of why it took so long for anatomically modern humans to develop such artistic and cultural ideas and objects has been defined by British archaeologist Colin Renfrew as the Sapient Paradox. Anthropologist Robin Dunbar has argued for a certain numerical threshold in population tending to occur in human groups all over the world. at which point groups naturally tend to splinter away from one another. It may be that in order to get past Dunbar's number of around 150 individuals, a great leap forwards in the psyche was necessary for late Paleolithic hunter-gatherer groups. A shared story or collective idea, spurred on not by biological evolution, but by culture. A hypothetical revolution in shared symbolism, which would eventually spur on mastery over nature, division of labour, increasingly impressive artistic achievements, and population growth. A revolution which began in the mind. The creative explosion of the Upper Paleolithic, most commonly represented by cave art and the famous Venus figurines, is well known in popular culture. Less well known are the vast amounts of worked items that went alongside them, signalling the apparent newfound harnessing of a vast amount of raw materials such as bone, antler, ivory, shells and minerals. The latter being especially common in Natufian settlements. Still considered hunter-gatherers who invested significant amounts of time into creating such artistic pieces. Given the sheer amount of time and effort invested, such pieces must have been immensely important. Just maybe early indicators of a shared culture to unite a people together, such as that so clearly and strikingly depicted at Göbekli Tepe. The organisational abilities required to deal with ever more seasonal and changing environments in the past has long been identified as a key factor in human advancement. The work of Robert Braidwood went further, seeing agricultural emergence as a manifestation of human ingenuity, our ability to make life better through technology, by creating a surplus, such as can be seen with the Natufians and at Göbekli Tepe. Surpluses which could eventually be appropriated by people in positions of authority, for individual rather than collective gain, leading to the hierarchical societies usually favoured by farmers. For Robert Braidwood then, this settling in process allowed for a deeper understanding of the environment than ever before, and the development of requisite technologies to manipulate it, allowing humans to bring plants and animals under their control. And yet, despite the mounting evidence gathered over the last 200 years and more, the Enlightenment vision of the noble savage, first conjured up by French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, is still the prevailing view of hunter-gatherer societies in popular culture. Of simple people living simple lives, with very little culture to speak of. Ethnological studies of very unique groups, such as the Kalahari and Mbuti Pygmies in the 1960s, further complicated the picture, as seeming to somehow represent all hunter-gatherer groups that have ever existed. The reality, as we have seen, is very different, and much more varied and complex. Far away, in the dense heart of the Amazon rainforest. Anthropologists began studying another hunter-gatherer group to survive into the 20th century, making their home deep in the Brazilian wilderness. The Nambikawara still regularly alternate between densely settled villages in the wet season and wandering bands in the dry. Between strict hierarchies and loose egalitarianism, depending on which particular mode suits the current situation best. The reality is that human culture is exceptionally malleable, and human beings never simple. Let us now consider even earlier examples of organised communal sites and markers of complexity. For this, we must go back even further, deep into the midst of the last ice age. Around 25,000 years ago, in a wide arc from what is now Spain to the open steppe land of Siberia, an extraordinary flourishing of human culture took place. In those millennia, just before the last glacial maximum, at the very height of the last cold period of the Ice Age, it was a world utterly unrecognisable to today. A world surprisingly full of life. In the summer months in particular, near never-ending seasonal parklands would open up along the river valleys and ahead of glaciers. Populated by vast herds of migrating bison, deer, and a wide variety of megafauna, much of which is now extinct. Moments of calm amidst the brutal, unforgiving cold. Of course, one of those creatures is much more famous than the rest. The largest of all, and absolutely vital to the survival of humanity in that harsh environment. For this was the land of the Mammoth steppe. And in this often surprisingly lush world of vast river valleys and colossal herds, some of the earliest evidence of human sedentism and even very early tenets of so-called Neolithicization have been found. Modest clans and tribes sheltered in the life-filled pockets between tundra and forest zones. First defined by Dorothy Garrett in the 1930s, the archaeological culture we know today as Gravettian lasted for over 10,000 years in that bitterly harsh environment. Almost as much time from Göbekli Tepe to today. And yet, though today the image of a perennial struggle to survive for our Ice Age ancestors is fixed in the public imagination, this was clearly not always the case. The the Gravettians spent significant amounts of energy in creating art. Almost all of which is lost. Though the famous Venus figurines, over 100 of which are known, give some small hint of the lives of these people. Arguably, for the very first time, beginning to live in settled, long-lasting communities. The eastern variant of the Gravettian, nestled in the Pavlovian hills of southern Moravia, also lived settled lives. But here, they did so in vast, open-air settlements, the remains of which have survived to the present. Though multitudes exist in a rich archaeological landscape stretching far out into what is now the plains of Russia, one of the most famous and important is in the modern-day Czech Republic. Its name is Dolní Věstonice, and it is in this region that we get not just some of the first evidence for large settlements in the world, but of burials too. Dolní Věstonice is an impressive sight. In the midst of a mighty perimeter fence of mammoth bone, a massive bonfire burned. Surrounded by elaborately built circular structures, also made of mammoth bone. Likely covered in skins and hide rendering. Within the perimeter fence, an abundance of artistic depictions of humans and animals have been found, alongside significant evidence of vegetal remains too, and all manner of smaller animals caught in nets. Also inside the enclosure, alongside an abundance of art and symbolism, is found not only the earliest evidence of weaving found anywhere, but shells originating in the distant Mediterranean. Evidence of far-reaching contacts, or actual wide-roaming journeys. Outside of the perimeter fence, slightly upriver, was a sunken structure containing a hearth and the remains of some 2,300 clay figurines. Perhaps evidence of a separation between domesticity and ritual life. Further to the east, in an isolated enclave in the depths of Siberia, the similar Malta Buret culture went about their lives, also living in massive mammoth bone structures in the open air, and also spending significant energy in the creation of artistic works. It is at sites like this, from as early as around 25,000 years ago, that several innovations appear to suggest burgeoning movements toward the harnessing of agriculture. The great human experiment in full force. Though, as we know now, perched in an environment particularly susceptible to environmental change, the odds were stacked up against them. And those mammoth structures themselves, as we shall see, could often be much larger, sometimes being referred to as monumental. At Kostenki in Russia, a recently discovered example of megalithic mammoth bone architecture has been uncovered. Originating in the Aurignacian period of around 40,000 years ago, this site shows signs of an impressively lengthy series of habitations from then onwards. In just one find within an astonishing archaeological landscape, in around 23,000 BC, the remains of at least 60 mammoths had been arrayed into a massive circular structure, over 12 meters in diameter. It is quite simply one of the most impressive Paleolithic finds ever made. Research at another Russian site, Udinovo, suggests that these so-called mammoth houses may not in fact have been dwellings at all in the conventional sense, but carefully planned and built to commemorate a great mammoth hunt, the meat, hides and bones of which must have created a sizable surplus for the community, which also undertook artistic endeavours and exchanged animal pelts, amber and seashells over great distances. It all begs the question: could sites like Dolny Vestanice, Kostenki and Udinovo have been seasonal congregation places where people came together annually to trade, to swap stories, to feast in the safety of a winter sanctuary, and perhaps even create elaborate monuments and artistic works? Just maybe an early form of Göbekli Tepe. The only constant in those days was change, and before it could fully develop into fruition, the lifestyle of the mammoth hunters was extinguished. In the wake of advancing ice sheets rolling down from the north to the last glacial maximum of around 20,000 years ago, Dolny Vestanice and many other sites like it were abandoned, their people forced to move ever southwards to escape the certain death of the permafrost. By around 18,000 BC, however, permanent settlements of considerable scale once again began to form, in areas particularly abundant in life. At the sites of Mezin and Mazarich in northern Ukraine, found on the banks of major river systems, were the annual north-south migrations of horses, reindeer, bison and mammoth could easily be hunted. Spectacular, permanent mammoth bone structures again became the norm. Dating to around 18,000 and 13,000 BC respectively, this was the age of a second apogee for the settled, complex hunter-gatherers of the Mammoth Steppe, especially in the regions in what is now the Russian plain and in Eastern Europe. Again, heavy stone industry, artistic flourishes, the separation of domestic spaces from those considered to be ceremonial, carefully curated burials, and the importance of vegetal food can be found. And of course, most impressively, solid and very large, elaborately made structures built of mammoth bones. Today, we call this era the Epicsettian. During those millennia, from around 16,000 to 10,000 BC, in a great arc from Krakow to Moscow, people again lived permanently in impressive circular houses of mammoth tusk and bone. Described by anthropologist Olga Soffer as Pleistocene public works, many of them go far beyond the needs of domesticity. Arrayed in rhythmic patterns that swirl artistically. What happened inside remains a mystery, but is often theorized to be at least in part of a ritual nature. Again, we must ask the question, are these the prototypes for the sunken temples of Göbekli Tepe? In Western Europe too, in the land of the cave painters, an archaeological culture we know today as the Magdalenian, the world was also changing. By around 15,000 BC, as the ice finally withheld its hold on the continent for good, the days of the woolly mammoth were numbered. In its place came an abundance of reindeer. The epic, wide-roaming seasonal migrations of these subarctic animals might not seem conducive to a semi-settled way of life for those following them. And yet, there were places the hunters went back to, year on year on year. Several so-called Magdalenian-era mega-sites have been found. Winter enclaves of the French Perigord and Spain's Cantabrian coast, with deep records of human activity, where sizable groups of people may have annually congregated to take shelter during the early autumn, before moving on in spring. During the time of the Magdalenian, as lush animals and plants flooded in to replace the barren tundra in the centuries following the last glacial maximum, southwest France was to become one of the most heavily populated areas in Europe. Bolstered by the vast numbers of fauna available to hunt, between around 15,000 and 10,000 BC, these were people living complex lives, with a wide variety of hunting strategies, gathering techniques, and artistic and cultural pursuits, including, of course, cave art. Found in an abundance of locations, but famous from sites like Altamira and Lascaux. Masterpieces of Paleolithic art. At French sites like La Madeleine and Abbey Poteau, marine shells, animal pelts, and significant quantities of amber speak of trade, or at least exchange networks, spreading far and wide across the continent. At such winter times, According to the work of archaeologist Randall White, who studied reindeer teeth and antlers, there is evidence of heightened cultural creativity in the form of cave art, carvings and ornaments, and very possibly social differentiation. It is at least possible that these winter communes gave rise to or facilitated already known rituals and religious rites, carried innately with the clans down the millennia. A set of customs not vastly different to certain Inuit societies of the last 200 years. In the early 20th century, French anthropologist Marcel Mauss spent significant amounts of time studying the Inuit communities of the subarctic Americas and Eurasia, finding them to organise their societies in certain unique ways. Very different to the settled agricultural societies that cover most of the globe. During the winter, a relatively authoritarian structure would form, dictated to and governed by confraternities of priests, nobles, and commoners. In the spring, individualistic egalitarianism would arise once more, as people spread out into the landscape again to forage and hunt. Before eventually, the next autumn, perhaps in a timeless scene that echoes down the ages, they would gather again for intense communal celebrations of cosmic order and the cycle of the world. In their recent book, The Dawn of Everything, anthropologist David Graeber and archaeologist David Wengrow entertain the notion that similarly structured societies and customs may have actually been the driving force behind the creation of the Göbekli Tepe phenomenon. The construction of enclosures now even being linked by isotopic evidence to periods of annual superabundance, when vast herds of gazelle would descend on the Haran plain, creating an immense surplus of food for the hunters living nearby. As we have seen time and time again, our ancestors weren't just our equals in cognitive capacity, but in intellect, even philosophy too. And so we turn back to the megalith builders of the Urfa plain. Despite their impressive size and the great skill of their construction, the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe seem only to have been used for a relatively short amount of time, much less, for example, than some of the previously discussed Ice Age sites. Their raising and ultimately ritual deaths and burials, often within just a few generations, may well have been the point. Hierarchies raised to the sky, only to be torn down again as part of some long-lost ceremony. Just maybe, it is festival activities at sites like these that the very first beginnings of larger societies and nations first began to coalesce, united by stories and the links fostered during those communal times. Indeed, the abundance of flint shards found all over the surface of Göbekli Tepe, many of which were brought in from afar, suggests trading or exchange activities with distant groups, or even full-blown seasonal migrations. Whether the stones themselves were taboo for most of the year, access denied to anyone but a hypothesized temple elite, but given free access during festival times, we can't be sure. Left to conjure fleeting visions of a medieval carnival or Roman Saturnalia, where societal roles were switched, the world turned upside down. There is, however, concrete evidence in the abundant remains of gazelle, boar, goat, red deer, sheep, oxen, vultures, ducks, and an entire menagerie of birds, most of the animals depicted on the monoliths, that Göbekli Tepe was very likely a site for feasting events. But what did those feasts actually look like? Turning to the far edge of the world, in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, another land of totem poles, awash with memory and the customs of long-venerated ancestors. The Kwakiutl people have exercised a midwinter ceremony for as long as anyone can remember. When people came from afar to congregate and regroup. Under the harsh grip of an icy black sky, a shifting ritual of so-called bear dancers and fool dancers replaced the usual social hierarchy. In scenes reminiscent of Roman Saturnalia and the medieval carnival, the midwinter is a time when the lowest of the low are elevated to the highest positions in society, and vice versa. Though of course separated by vast gulfs of distance and time. Perhaps some small similarity may be found with those purported festivals on the southern edge of the Taurus Mountains so long ago. For evidence of the festivals themselves in that so-called Stone Hills culture, we can look to Göbekli Tepe's sister sites too. Navali Chori in particular is a site which has yielded an unusually rich array of artifacts of many types. One rare engraved stone basin on the floor of one of the houses has even been suggested to be a sacrificial altar. It was carved with an unusual central figure. Originally interpreted as a turtle, opinions have shifted since to interpret the scene as a woman in dance. Feet pointed down, her arms raised to the sky. If true, this would be one of the earliest dancing scenes in all of history. An activity very often tied up in festival and religious activities. Found in almost every society in history. We even have evidence of musical instruments too, stretching far back into the Paleolithic, in the form of bull roarers, clappers, rattles and scrapers. When reconstructed and played today, they recall primordial sounds of travellers dancing to the drum of the divine. Pilgrims even come from nearby and distant lands to sacrifice, to feast and to celebrate in the shadow of the obelisks. We also know that Göbekli Tepe's significance extended far beyond the Urfa plain. Obsidian deposits originating in Cappadocia to the northwest and beyond, perhaps brought by travelling specialists, imbuing items and themselves with power and energy for the year to come. Other travellers at the dawn of settled life, entertainers, healers, storytellers, cannot be proven. Any evidence that might have once existed, long ago having disappeared into nothing. Though we can speculate nonetheless. Since the very earliest days of archaeology and anthropology, scholars have sought an understanding of how our world came to be. One of the most enduring and popular ideas was an ominous one: that warfare lay at the heart of everything. Social complexity spurred on by fear and hatred above all. And yet, in recent decades, this concept has been undermined by 1,000 cuts. Again and again, new discoveries at sites like Corral in the Americas, and now at Göbekli Tepe, lying at the very beginning of settled societies, show no evidence of any kind of fighting. Instead, a new theory has increasingly risen in stature. The concept that it might actually be ritual that led to the adoption of agriculture and stratification in its initial development. Though they weren't quite there yet, the affluent hunters of the Stone Hills culture would be soon, and just maybe they needed a revolution in the mind in order to be able to do so. After all, ritual and a strictly followed set of ideas are necessary for a farmer society. Ideas which often give no instant gratification like that of the hunters. Instead, immense amounts of work has to be invested in some ill-defined and sometimes even illusory goal. Early agrarian societies needed a high level of social cohesion and management, simply in order to motivate their people to get past this first step. Could it be that such powerful bonds were fostered at sites like Göbekli Tepe, where shared stories and myths unite people, with feasting as the ultimate social glue? Towards the end of the 20th century, basing his ideas on a lifetime of research in the field, anthropologist Brian Hayden took this idea further with the concept of competitive feasting. In his hypothesis, any surplus of food resources could be amassed by small emerging hunter-gatherer hierarchies and invested to gain a labour force. In a traditional society of hunter-gatherers, skilled hunters are able to leverage immediate social capital in the form of their skill set alone. The unskilled are dead weight. In a farming society, actual skills are less important. It is physical capital, goods that are valued above all. Goods which can be inherited and significant wealth accrued with no skills involved at all. Eventually, when the latter groups grew in power, everything was to change. Inherent inequality going forth. Hayden's hypothesis continues that once competition for influence between rivals begins, experimentation in farming is driven forwards, as the potential to produce a much larger surplus is realised. Individuals can then pursue prestige and power through favours owed to them. And yet, feasts are clearly not always competitive in nature. The norm may even have been the complete opposite of Hayden's idea. That feasting was egalitarian in nature, aimed at counteracting tendencies towards the formation of unequal hierarchies, and promoting the obligatory sharing of food. Though it may well be that feasts had little to do with the harnessing of agriculture. After all, animals and grains were all wild at Göbekli Tepe. The origins of agriculture could well be entirely separate from that nearly 12,000-year-old sanctuary of megaliths. Nevertheless, regardless of the origins of agriculture, it is clear that when societies knew how to organise their members effectively, they gained an evolutionary advantage. A great deal of energy going not into obviously productive work, or even food producing, but in formulating a sense of unity and shared identity. The emergence of agriculture, then, could be tied to investment in ideology. A greater societal good that would allow willingly for the tolerance of inequalities and hierarchy to form. The same sort of sentiment that some 7,000 years later would lead far-flung people to bring their cattle to Durrington Walls near Stonehenge. Even later at Delphi and Cusco. And at modern festivals too, where people still go to hear news from neighbours, to meet husbands and wives, and to inadvertently spread communal culture. But, of course, there is often another aspect to it as well. A chance to reason with the other world and the divine. In 1955, Russian quarry workers digging pits some 200 kilometers east of Moscow came upon something they weren't expecting. The ruins of an ancient settlement buried in the clay. When the radiocarbon dates came back, the group of experts called in from the Russian Academy of Science could scarcely believe the results. Scattered over 5 kilometers on the edge of a remote Russian riverbank, the prehistoric settlement of Sungir turned out to be one of the earliest recorded sites of anatomically modern humans found anywhere in Eurasia. Dating to somewhere between 32 and 28,000 BC. Though still largely unknown in popular culture, particularly in the West due to the disconnect of the Cold War, over the next 20 years of excavations, the wildly significant discoveries kept coming in. Perhaps most astonishing of all, both in terms of their state of preservation and their contents, were the grave sites. Also some of the earliest ever found in Eurasia, and as we shall see, among the most unusual. Grave 2 consisted of a pair of adolescent children, laid down facing one another head to head, along with an adult leg bone filled with ochre. Grave 1 contained an adult male, similarly coated in red ochre, a substance associated with religious rites and death rituals all over the world, from the very beginning to today. But most amazing of all were the thousands upon thousands of intricately crafted ivory beaded pieces of jewellery, clothing and spears among other items, quite literally coating the bodies. Some 13,000 beads in all having been uncovered. An artistic effort that would have taken an estimated 10,000 hours to produce. A truly vast investment. As well as being taken as some of the earliest direct evidence for religious practices in Eurasia, the Sungir burials are also often seen as a particularly early example of highly developed systems of rank existing deep in the Paleolithic past. It is a view further bolstered by a similarly ancient find in Italy, known as El Principe, adorned with a similarly incredible array of grave goods. And yet, further investigations into Paleolithic burials, from the Aurignacian to the Gravettian to the Magdalenian, from Spain to Russia to the Levant, may hint at more unusual reasons for having such ornate burials. After all, no fortifications, storehouses, palaces, or any other evidence of conventional chieftains have been found, let alone anything resembling a state that we would recognise. Elsewhere in Eurasia during the Paleolithic, a striking number of burials contain individuals with unusual physical characteristics, sometimes placed in striking and unusual poses, spiralling outwards, crouched, or laid out facing other deceased individuals. At Krems in Austria, identical twins were found, their bodies flanked by great mammoth tusk lances and coated in beads and ochre. At Ramoto in Calabria, an individual with dwarfism was discovered. And at Grimaldi Cave, an extremely tall individual with gigantism was given special care. In recent decades, British archaeologist Paul Petit has argued for significant efforts being made by those interring the dead to pin certain deceased individuals down. With mammoth bones, wooden planks, stones, or vast amounts of decorated ornaments. Often tightly binding the bodies in place. Rather than reverence, the evidence sometimes suggests more a culture of fear. Just like in societies throughout history, lasting well into the modern era, mourners perhaps beseeching the dead to stay in the afterlife, even making certain precautions to stop them from coming back. From the Moche pyramid builders of the Peruvian coast, to the passage graves of Neolithic Orkney, throughout history and all over the world, particularly in ancient shamanistic societies, individuals who are different in some way, either mentally or physically, have often been thought to possess unusual supernatural powers, deemed closer to the gods. Perhaps the so-called princely burials might have been different in some way too. Maybe they were albino, autistic, or another genetic condition otherwise unseen in the archaeological record. Weighed down with objects to celebrate them, but also maybe to contain their dangerous powers after death. Just maybe they are evidence of some of the earliest shamans in human history. Turning back to the mammoth hunters of the Moravian hills, a number of burials were also found at the site of Dolní Věstonice, one in particular deserving special mention. Absolutely coated in ochre, laid to rest beside a mighty mammoth bone and with a hand resting on a fox, the remarkably complete skeleton of a woman around 40 years old was found. And like the other Ice Age burials of the Paleolithic, she had several striking features. In addition to her relatively advanced age, old enough to have been a grandparent, from birth, the left side of her face had very visible deformities. Was this so-called elder of Dolní Věstonice considered to be touched by the gods? As we have seen, a number of Venus figurines were found at the site, including an isolated spot around 80 meters upstream containing well over 2,000 clay figurines of various animals. Most of them in fragments. Perhaps magical items, created to be ritualistically broken. The most incredible of all, however, had exactly the same facial abnormalities as the elder, making it very likely to have been a model or representation, perhaps to remember her in future generations. It begs the question, do all the Venus figurines represent actual individuals who lived so many millennia ago. Given the discovery of the elder alongside a fox, an animal often associated with ritualistic shape-shifting trances, she is often thought to have been a shaman. Perhaps the dugout was her proto-temple. Whether she was an early oracle or Ice Age prophet, clearly she was someone to be commemorated, remembered. And perhaps most importantly, not to be brought back to bring her wrath upon the living. And there is much more evidence of shamanic activity in the Ice Age. In 1939, an astonishing ivory statue was found in a German cave. When carbon dated, the Lion Man of Hohenstein-Stadel was found to be as much as 41,000 years old. Though interpretations of this striking figure vary extensively, one argument is that it depicts a half-animal, half-man figure. Just maybe in the midst of a shamanistic trance. With shapeshifting often considered to be an integral part. These deer antler headdresses from Starcar in Northumbria, dating to roughly the same time as Göbekli Tepe, are also often seen as evidence for shamanic activity. As is this roughly contemporary cave painting from southern France, known as the Sorcerer, which may well depict a shamanistic ritual in process. Given the shreds of evidence we've seen from the very beginnings of humanity's journey in Eurasia to the ends of the Ice Age and beyond, for the last 50,000 years or so at least, it seems likely that ritual and religious experience have always been a part of the social fabric. A hypothetical creative explosion linked with the need for social cohesion in the cold north. Maybe this was how smaller family units were able to congregate into larger clans and tribes at certain times of the year, bound together by links to the ancestors, religious rites, and perhaps even the worship of common deities. Culture by that time well and truly having outgrown biological evolution. As far as the elaborate so-called princely burials of Ice Age Europe are concerned, hereditary systems of rank seem the most improbable interpretation of all. Again, this begs the question: is there a missing piece of the puzzle at Göbekli Tepe? Like in ancient Peru and Egypt, where the erection of monuments was a holy task in itself, a form of worship dictated by a priesthood. Was there a shadowy cabal pulling the strings in the foothills of the Urfa plain? Not hereditary chiefs, but a meritocratic theocracy. In the year 2000, the translation into English of a relatively unknown French scholar's work not only caused a stir in the archaeological community, but ever-elusive ripples into the realm of popular culture. Ever since Gordon Child's Oasis theory and the like in the early 1900s, the majority of attempted explanations for the so-called Neolithic revolution had focused on economic reasoning. Geographical needs and material circumstances dictating growth into agricultural societies. Enter Jacques Cauvin. In the early 1990s, after more than 50 years of research involving digs at some of the most important early Neolithic sites in the Near East, Cauvin went public with a completely different idea. In The Birth of the Gods and the Origins of Agriculture, Jacques Cauvin suggested not material reasons for the shift from hunter-gathering to agriculture, but a transformation that began in the mind. A profound cultural transformation within the human psyche from around the 13th to the 10th millennia BC. Primarily involving a shift in perspective from seeing humanity as a part of nature to being outside of it. Eventually, with not only the potential to dominate the natural world, but the right. In other words, in order to become a farmer, you have to think like one first. Perhaps like all later religions, beginning as a single creative spark. Rather than economic need, environmental shift, or even individual social promotion, a collective epiphany expressed in new symbols and ideas. At the very dawn of civilization. Though, of course, it remains completely untestable, if even at all true, and it could go alongside other theories to a certain extent. Jacques Cauvin's Birth of the Gods would solve Colin Renfrew's Sapient Paradox, of why humanity only began the road to true societal complexity by around 10,000 BC. After being anatomically modern for as much as 300,000 or 400,000 years. Cauvin's death the very next year in 2001 only added to the allure of the theory, which remains immensely influential amongst archaeologists today. Far from the rigid economic reasoning of Braidwood and Child, Jacques Cauvin evokes distant ancestral memories of ecstatic dance beneath the colossal T-shaped pillars of elder days. From the early 20th century to today, a number of sociologists and anthropologists alike have studied the nature of religious ecstasy. Commonly observed all over the world and in all walks of life. perhaps most notable being the work of Mircea Eliade and Emil Durkheim. For them, the effervescence and elation of religious ceremony has a tendency to foment a sense of belonging and contentment in a community. Very possibly in prehistoric and historic times, allowing for ever larger conglomerations of people to coalesce than ever before. Sometimes ultimately resulting in asymmetrical power structures beginning to form. An expert in world religions, Mircea Eliade in particular, talked of the pursuits of ecstasy being an integral part of the religious experience. The transformative feeling of awe, for example, being one that goes hand in hand with music, monuments, landscapes, and nature. Music and dancing in particular, often inducing trance-like altered states and a sense of unity. All of which were present at Göbekli Tepe. Of course, by their very nature, Jacques Cauvan's ideas remain entirely untestable. Little more than hints of a shamanic council leading a societal revolution, awash with awe and ecstatic devotion, building on time-honoured ideas, stretching back tens of thousands of years into the Aurignacian, but imbued with newfound immediacy. Annual festival centres, apparently common in older hunting societies for exchange and verbal communication, ever growing and ever spreading the new word. It's even possible that domestication of plants and animals ultimately came about in part as a means of feeding increasingly large groups of people drawn to holy sites to build and to worship. Domesticated plants and animals showing up slightly later at sites like Navali Chori and Chianu. The art of which still very much echoed that found at Göbekli and Karahan Tepe, and their own older levels. Of course, another equally possible theory, favoured by Klaus Schmidt, holds that religion actually kept the hunters of Göbekli Tepe from pursuing agriculture, where others to the south did so, being a last holdout of a resolute culture of hunters on the precipice of new beginnings. In the late 1800s, German philosopher Karl Marx, one of the most influential thinkers ever to put pen to paper, implied religion to be a conscious invention of the elite to control the masses. The reality, as usually is the case, seems to be far more complex. Religious ideas, conceived of until relatively recently as a form of science, seem to have been utterly intertwined with humanity since the very beginning. We humans are a curious and immensely creative species. And as French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss first pointed out in the 1950s and 60s, in prehistoric societies, mythological thought and religion were the only ways of explaining and exploring the world and the bigger questions within. Above all else, the individuals who built Göbekli Tepe were our intellectual equals. Possessing exactly the same mental capacity that we have today, just with a more basic cultural tradition and knowledge base, but no less colourful creativity to draw from. Far from a shadowy elite controlling the masses, like scientists and doctors today, early shamans or proto-priests would very likely have spent their days attempting to help their communities, to intervene with spirits, perhaps ancestors, and ultimately acting for the greater good. If they didn't, they probably wouldn't have been in their positions for much longer. Like the Vespers at Delphi in the Greek classical age, perhaps going into psychedelic trances to draw out near impenetrable, yet nonetheless useful prophecies for those in need. And maybe, like the Vespers at Delphi, such trances took an obvious toll on their bodies, even killing them after a time. And of course, much more than today, death was very much a part of life in those days. And sometimes, just like in practically all societies that ever evolved, at one stage or another, a situation might be serious enough so as to warrant or require a sacrifice. There is a certain Hittite ritual from the 2nd millennium BC, recorded on cuneiform tablets which can still be read today. It speaks of a time-honoured tradition in ancient Anatolia, where members of a community would symbolically pile up sources of evil and anxiety onto a male goat. The sorry animal would then be chased out into the desert and left to its fate, thus relieving the society of its troubles for a time. It's been argued that Pillar 1 at Göbekli Tepe could indicate a similar ritual. Of course, the origins of the idea of a scapegoat. A ritual carried out unconsciously, time and time again, throughout human history, in almost every society on Earth, and still very much in use today. Of course, in many cases, much more than a goat is metaphorically forced out into the desert. As we have seen, at Chianu, a potential altar has been found, which may well suggest human sacrifice. One argument being that sacrifice of animals, and sometimes people, became necessary to relieve societal pressure during hard times. A placebo sometimes being effective as a morale boost or deliverer from stress. Indeed, from its very beginnings, the act of sacrifice does seem to have been an integral part of settled agricultural societies. perhaps a means of psychologically being able to come to terms with the strange situation of delayed gratification and occasional failure of harvests. An uneasy feeling that something has to be done to mediate with the divine. And in the aftermath, very often creating a sense of unity and community. Much more so if things do eventually turn around. Ultimately, as agriculture transformed their way of life, the newly sedentary Neolithic peoples of the southern Taurus Mountains ceased to make the pilgrimage to the festival sites of the ancestors. Covering the circles in soil, never to be seen again. Clearly, by around 8000 BC, the world had changed. The T-shaped pillars irrelevant in the face of new religious epiphanies. Whether any memory of their existence survived down the long millennia, we can only speculate. Somewhere along the line, many thousands of years later, by the 4th millennium BC, the late Paleolithic shamans had become a priesthood. Whether any elements of deep-seated lore from the T-shaped pillars survived into those days, just as they had from the Upper Paleolithic, we will likely never know. Though it remains at least possible. Skull removal and decoration, for example, continued in use for thousands of years after the Stonehill's culture disappeared. Just as it had done before with the Natufians. And there are two-headed Janus figures at Göbekli, Karahan and Gaziantep, just as there continued to be in much later millennia and today. Perhaps representations of the duality of existence. By the time of ancient Sumeria in the 3rd millennium BC, when stories began to be recorded in writing for the very first time, all manner of much older spoken tales managed to survive too, finding their way into the cuneiform archives of long-deceased city-states and forgotten kings. One of those tales speaks of a sacred mountain, Duku, home of the ancient Anora gods. A sacred mountain sometimes associated with the hilly region around the Taurus and Zagros range, on the very northern edge of the Mesopotamian world. It's a long shot, but Klaus Schmidt thought it at least possible that some shadow of the anthropomorphous pillars of Göbekli Tepe ultimately survived down the ages, passed down by individuals from one generation to the next, to become myth and legend. After all, what else do we have but stories? Thanks for watching. As always, I'm your host, Pete Kelly. Another massive thank you to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Download the game now using my link in the description below. And if you're looking for more history from me, I also have a self-titled channel where I explore the world's greatest archaeological sites, and a free newsletter Just input your email address and you'll get monthly stories from me on my adventures, bringing you along for the ride. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.